I know we're being reductionistic by calling these big names of dualism and Western, and but you an essay that you wrote really spoke to me, which was "To Reason with a Madman," and this essay really talked about your recent feeling of futility, where we are trying to convince each other using arguments, and that wasn't really moving forward, not in the political, not in the science, not in even the social arenas. And you talked about the power of fiction, in a sense, of actually creating stories that we can't argue. We can argue with the interpretation of the story, but we can't argue with the story itself. And at the same time, the last 2 years, you've written a lot about expository prose. How are you reconciling these ways of talking and writing?
Yeah. I this was, I don't know that when I wrote that essay a year or two ago, but I had been for a long time becoming more and more impatient with the limitations of expository prose because of the resistance. Because if you're making an argument, then you're inviting arguing. If you're saying this is, then you're inviting people to say, no, it isn't, that is. So it tends, like, no matter how persuasive and eloquent you are, you're inviting people into a true or false, yes or no mentality. And to some extent, I try to preempt that in my expository writing. I say things like, you might be thinking something, something, something. I try to include all of the different reactions to it in real time. But still, there is that limitation. Whereas, as you were saying, a story, you can't argue with a story. I mean, it's not, because it's not an argument. So it gets underneath intellectual defenses, especially, and it may be that you tell a story and it does actually challenge somebody's worldview. Like if somebody thinks, for example, that, gay people are awful, horrible people, and you tell a story about, your best friend who's gay and how generous and kind he is, like that is going to still be a challenge to that person's worldview. And they might make a story that preserves their worldview. Well, this person's an exception, or, Charles is, they might be able to make some story, but nonetheless, something gets in. So so especially in really polarized times, sometimes we're left with no alternative, like no argument, no conversation, no debate can actually be had. No one's going to change their mind when the most important thing is being right. But a story, it gets underneath those walls, and it gets in. And the thing is, people love to hear stories. You automatically have somebody's attention when you tell a story well. And if you let go, the more you let go to, and here's the moral of the story, then the more receptive people will be to the story.
I think that's a challenge, right? Because you want to make an argument, you want to leave a moral, and at the same time, you have to let go entirely of it, and even risk that the story might be interpreted or felt in another way that the writer wasn't supposed to, or at least it wasn't his intention.